The idea of spray painting my Triban 100 has been in my head for a long time. Due to lack of time and motivation, as well as my fear of ruining my bike being too great, I just didn't get to it. But since we've been in lockdown twice already this year, I suddenly had more than enough time on my hand and my boredom overcame my doubts. Also, I have become a pro on this topic anyways, after I watched a whole 2 YouTube videos on this subject. What I'm trying to say here is that I didn't do nearly as much research on painting bike frames as I should have. And I rather jumped right into it. So please understand that this video is not supposed to be a step-by-step guide on how you can get a perfect DIY paint job on your bike, but much more a vlog in which I share my own experience with my first paint job, as somebody with no prior experience at all, so that you might see what you can expect from a first-time paint job. So if you're thinking of painting your bike, please note that you should do your own research, because like I already said, I'm a complete rookie on this topic. Before we get started though, I just wanted to say thank you to over 100 subscribers. I know this doesn't sound like much, but I'm happy that at least some of you decided to subscribe. But without further ado, let's get right into it. The first step of a bike paint job is to remove all the parts from it, like the handlebar, seat post, wheels, brakes, shifters, etc. That in itself isn't that hard. What can be a bit tricky though is removing the bottom bracket and the headset. Both require special tools and quite a bit of force. But with a little bit of elbow grease and with the help of some YouTube tutorials, I managed to have all the parts removed from my frame in about an hour. Once that was done, I removed all the decals that were on my bike. I used an X-Acto knife to lift the edges and pulled them off. For decals that would tear when I tried to pull them off, I used a hairdryer to soften the adhesive. With this method, I was able to get rid of all the stickers in just a few minutes. And with that, the frame was ready for the prep work, because in order for the new paint to have something to hold onto, you need to prepare the frame surface. In any case, this means to remove most, if not all, of the original paint coats. There are numerous ways of doing that, but since I don't really know what I'm doing, I'll just show you how I did it. For my carbon fork, I really had no other choice than to sand everything down. I used wet sanding paper and started with 400 grit and worked myself up to 800. This was quite a bit of work, but since my fork is quite smooth, it was just a matter of an hour or two until all the old paint was removed. With carbon parts, you only have to watch out that you don't sand too deep. After all, you don't want to remove any of the structural material. My aluminium frame, on the other hand, was not at all as simple to prepare. My first approach was to simply remove all the paint, leaving me with bare metal. But then I learned that aluminum builds up an oxide layer in mere seconds while exposed to air. The problem with that is that, according to my research, most lacquers wouldn't hold onto this oxide layer very well. So I thought it would be a good idea to only sand down the clear coats and the paint coats, leaving me only with the original primer. So I started sanding just like I did with my fork. The problem with that was that it took me ages to remove any paint. It has heaps of edges, not to mention the welds, which got so much on my nerves that I eventually gave in and decided to go back to my first approach. But instead of sanding everything down, I decided to use paint stripper. This was way easier and a lot less time consuming, considering I only had to apply a coat of paint stripper and wait for a few hours. Then I came back and used a scraper to remove the paint, which had become soft. For the tricky spots as well as the welds, I used seal wool to remove the paint. Of course, this revealed bare aluminium, so my paint job probably won't last as long as it could have otherwise. On the other hand, this has easily saved me lots and lots of hours that I would have otherwise spent sanding everything down like a maniac. So I guess I can live with this trade-off. By the way, I used respiratory protection while sanding and also while using the paint stripper. And you should too, bearing in mind that the dust that gets set free while sanding as well as the fumes from paint stripper will damage your lung otherwise. With all the paint removed, I cleaned both the frame and the fork. You are supposed to be using rubbing alcohol. I also read that silicone remover should work great, but I didn't have any on hand, so I used window cleaner. This is definitively not ideal, but good enough for me. After I made sure that I had removed the residue completely from all the surfaces, I had to make sure that there won't get any paint in the bottom bracket shell, the steering tube, as well as the seat post tube and any thread on my frame. Basically everywhere where there was no paint to begin with. I did this by masking everything off with tape while using an X-Acto knife to cut down protruding bits of tape. Then I went over all the edges with my fingernail 2 or 3 times in order to make sure that there would be no paint creeping under the tape later. The last step of prep work was to build a stand for my frame and fork. I used some old wood that was laying around and put together a base. On top of that I attached an old broomstick. I also made a smaller version for my fork. Both really don't look nice, but they feel sturdy enough to hold onto my bike parts for the next few days. Therefore, they were good enough. At this point I only needed to mount my parts on the stand and I could finally start with actually painting. Of course only with some respiratory protection. When it comes to spray painting, the first coat pretty much always is primer. After making sure that mine was compatible with aluminum, I put down a coat. Then, following the instructions on the bottle, I used 800 grit sandpaper to smoothen everything down. After that you're supposed to put on a second coat and repeat the progress. But since I only bought 1 bottle of primer, I didn't have enough left for a second coat. And so I left it at that. Again, not ideal, but good enough for me. I left it to dry for a few hours and then came back to start with the actual paint. As my main color, I chose white. So first of all I put on a light color of paint and followed it up with 2 heavier coats. I also wanted to have some colored stripes on my bike, so after I left the white paint to dry for an hour, I started masking everything off and put on the other colors just like I did with the white paint. Removing the masking tape after the paint dried for a bit and seeing how something that has been just an idea becoming reality was definitively one of the greatest moments of this project. But I was not done just yet, because in order to protect the paint coats from the elements and to make the colors really pop, I put on a clear coat on all my parts. It applies similar to the primer, the only difference being that it is, as the name suggests, clear, so I had a little bit of trouble actually seeing where I had already put enough clear coat as well as where there was some missing. I highly recommend using bright lights for this step, which makes seeing the lacquer a lot easier. And just like with the primer, I didn't have enough of it to make 2 coats, so I only put on 1 coat. So I guess not ideal, but good enough for me is the theme of this project. After that you should leave everything to dry for 48 hours or even more, just to be sure. And again, I didn't follow the instructions and I only left it to dry overnight and put my bike back together the next day, because I really was running out of time. This added a few minor defects to my paint job, but I really had no other choice. And with that my paint job was done. To be honest, I'm quite happy with how it turned out, even though it isn't anywhere near perfect. I really had expected worse, and despite the colors being a bit too bright for my taste, I still like how my bike looks now. I had a lot of fun with this project, and I think I also learned a thing or two about spray painting. If you're interested in doing your own paint job on your bike, you should just note that there is a ton of work involved with the process. Also, you have to have quite a bit of patience while leaving the paint to dry, so maybe before painting your whole bike you should start off with something easier like the stem and see if you really want to repeat the process for your whole bike. All in all, I probably spent about €100 on the paint and the tools that I used. Let me know what you think of my paint job, and thanks again for over 100 subscribers. I hope that you can understand that these videos always cost me a ton of time, so I really can't upload that often, but there will be new videos in the future. I hope I was able to help you with this video in some way. With that said, I say thank you for watching and goodbye.